Hello, class. Welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know that while some of the colonists complained about English trade restrictions, without them, there's a good chance that many of the colonists would be without basic tools necessary to uphold a decent standard of living? That while colonial governors technically had a lot of power on paper, the colonial legislatures controlled their salary. So we know who had the real power in that relationship. That the triangular trade wasn't exactly a triangle and was actually pretty complicated. And that while the Navigation Acts seem like unnecessary restrictions on colonial trade, one could actually argue that the colonies became significantly wealthier because of this relationship with England. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out, because today we will learn about that and more in episode 22, the triangular trade and mercantilism. Hello and welcome to class. Before we begin, I would first like to thank everyone who reached out to Bill, Zach, and me about recommendations for our trip to Boston. We had a great time. We did a lot of prep work for our upcoming episodes on the Revolutionary War, and it was a blast. It is safe to say that all three of us love the Revolutionary War and the Constitutional era, and we just can't wait until we have the opportunity to do episodes on that stuff. But like with everything, in order to fully understand what you're learning, you have to have proper context. So before we can get to our Revolutionary War and early Constitutional era episodes, we have to cover quite a few things first. Our next two episodes are going to be covering the triangular trade, mercantilism, the glorious revolution of 1689 and its effects on the colonies, and the various French and English conflicts that happened prior to the French and Indian War, sort of leading up to that major conflict in the colonies. These next two episodes will be critical in helping you to fully understand the relationship between the colonies and England in the late 17th century and as we move into the 18th century. This knowledge and understanding is going to provide significant depth that will help to fully grasp the importance of the French and Indian War and the actions by the English government following the war. As you know, the English colonies did not respond well to the many pieces of legislation passed by Parliament following the French Indian War, and their reactions led directly and indirectly to the Revolutionary War. So to catch everyone up, I want to briefly provide context for our lesson today. Last episode, we covered the trials and tribulations of African captives who were taken from their home, marched to the west coast of Africa, and shipped across the Atlantic. We went into detail about this transatlantic voyage, known as the Middle Passage. At the end of the episode, we touched briefly on Southern society and slavery's impact on its socioeconomic structure. Later in this podcast, we will revisit Southern society and the impact of slavery. Today, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're moving away from slavery and discussing broader economic and political developments during the 17th and 18th century. As we discuss the economic relationship between the colonies and England, there are a few things we need to keep in mind. Colonial life was underdeveloped compared to society in England. Some colonists didn't even own simple tools that were fairly second nature, such as a plow. Very few families owned wagons, and because of this, they ended up not having a lot of access to various products that were shipped in from around the world. They didn't have any reliable money or any consistent way to pay for things, therefore they had to rely on trade. And as you know, the English never really found gold or silver in the colonies. The Spanish did most of that, so the colonists relied quite a bit on furs to trade. Trade between England and the American colonies was really important to the success of the colonies. Most of the trade in the colonies went to England, while some went to the French and Germans and the Dutch. In the Western Hemisphere, the colonies all traded with the West Indies, and when they would trade with the West Indies, they would offer fish and agricultural goods to the West Indies, and of course the West Indies being the Caribbean. The West Indies would then offer sugar, molasses, and very importantly, slaves in return for this. Because remember, most of the slaves shipped across the Atlantic didn't originally end up in the American colonies. They were shipped to the West Indies, and then later they were traded to the American colonies for fish and, agricultural goods. Initially, in the early and mid 17th century, the colonies had quite a bit of freedom, and not just in terms of trade, but also in their local governments. See, each colony had a governor. This governor was the executive representative of the colony. Therefore, he could execute the law, appoint officials, call the local assemblies, and even at times dismiss the local assembly. And he could also propose legislation. In addition to these powers, he retained veto power over various colonial laws. Now, while it sounds like the colonial governor had quite a bit of authority, and which on paper technically he did, you have to remember that the colonies controlled the salary of the governor. Therefore, the colonial assemblies had what we would call the power of the purse. With this leverage over the governor, as you can imagine, the governors often compromised with colonial leaders. Most of these colonies had a two-house legislature, just like we have in our legislature today. They had an upper house and they had a lower house, and these legislatures would propose laws. And while technically the governor, once again, technically had the right to veto, these laws were often approved not only by the governor, but also by the government in London. So basically, there wasn't a lot of resistance in local government and quite a bit of freedom for the colonies, and this is sort of going to become a little bit of a theme throughout this episode, this idea of the colonies having and maintaining their freedom. While the English government initially provided this freedom with regards to trade and local government in the colonies, over time they tried to enact more strict enforcement of that, and it sort of ebbs and flows, but they first did it in the 1650s with the Navigation Acts, which we'll talk more about in just a few minutes. And the reason they did this is because England began to realize that, allowing the colonists and the traders a significant amount of independence wasn't really the best for England's bottom line. The colonies, on paper, have a duty to make the mother country more wealthy. And so England needed to figure out a way to make that happen. And this idea of the colonies making the mother country more wealthy is mercantilism. And mercantilism is a, quote, economic system whereby the government intervenes in the economy for the purpose of increasing national wealth. Pretty straightforward. So, what did England focus on in order to increase national wealth? Trade and slavery. Controlling trade with the colonies would increase England's grasp on the slave trade and in turn increase their national wealth. See, at this time there was an idea that there was only a certain amount of wealth in the world, and whichever nation could accumulate the most would become the most powerful. How do you accumulate the most wealth? You gather gold and silver, of course. And if there's a country like, Spain, who has more gold and silver than you, what do? Well, you sponsor pirates like Francis Drake to go and take their gold from them. That is what we call a win-win scenario. Spain loses gold, England gains gold. Retrospectively, the colonies get one step closer to independence. So, what would that be called? Win-win-win?
Win-win.
Win.
Fine.
But
It is done.
Yeah, that's it. Win-win-win. In addition to gathering precious metals through trade, England began to recognize the role that the colonies could play in helping them accumulate this wealth. But in order to spur trade, the colonies needed to figure out a way to produce their own goods. How did England make them produce their own goods? Well, they limited the amount of products that could come in from other countries. And this is where the Navigation Acts come into play, because in the 1650s, England does just that. Now, we do need to get this straight. At this time in the mid-17th century, England did not just use the colonies as a means to an end. I don't want to make England sound like such a bad guy. They didn't view the colonies as only a way to help increase the bottom line in England. The colonies were seen as part of a broader success of the English Empire. England was very proud of them, and the colonies were crucial to that success. England wanted the colonies to prosper because the wealthier the colonies became, the more impactful colonial trade became, and the wealthier England would be. So, a quick example to make my point, tobacco was actually not allowed to be grown in England. And the reason is that they didn't want it competing with colonial tobacco. In the end, England really desired a scenario in which the colonies were providing raw materials and England was providing the manufactured goods. Because of this, England passed pieces of legislation like the Wool Act of 1699, the Hat Act of 1732, and the Iron Act of 1750. Now, to be fair, these pieces of legislation were not good for the colonies. They forbid the production of these goods in the colonies, but at the same token, very similar to how tobacco was forbidden to be grown in England. By the way, the Iron Act of 1750, well, that was a rough one. This said that no finished iron products could be produced in the colonies. The Chesapeake and some of the mill colonies had a huge amount of iron, and this greatly limited their trade and, in turn, pissed them off quite a bit. The growth of trade with England created a transatlantic system, commonly referred to as the triangular trade. While the name triangular trade is a nice and simple name, it wasn't really a triangle, and it definitely was not simple. There were primarily 4 different regions, and I'm even oversimplifying by saying that, but there were primarily 4 different general regions involved in this trade. You have the colonies, England, West Africa, and the West Indies. So let's go through this trade just real briefly here, and I'm going to need you to focus for about 30 seconds while I describe this. So let's start with the West Indies. They would send goods to the colonies, ones that we've already mentioned, sugar, molasses, and slaves. So they'd send them north to the colonies. The colonies would then send back things like rice, fish, livestock, flour, and lumber. The colonies would then also send goods to England. They would send rice and indigo from the south, fish, tobacco, and furs from the mid-Atlantic and the north over to England, and England would then send back manufactured goods. England would also send Africa manufactured goods, and Africa, as you know, would send slaves to the West Indies and to the Americas. Got that? It's okay if you don't. Feel free to rewind and go through that 1 or even 2 more times, as much as it takes, but it is important to understand the basic trade that's going on between these 4 regions. The most important thing to understand about this trade, other than the fact that it really isn't a triangle, is that it was extremely complicated. The English Navigation Acts that were passed in the 17th century tried to simplify things a bit. They protected merchants in the colonies from a lot of foreign competition and, in turn, actually created a merchant class in these colonies. And for some in the merchant class, the Navigation Acts and being forced to trade primarily with England was actually quite a boon for their businesses. There becomes a clear socioeconomic divide through these different restrictions on trade, but look, when the merchants couldn't get the best deal from England, they would just illegally trade with other countries. And this smuggling, which we'll talk about more in a few minutes, was pretty rampant. The most important aspect of the triangular trade, other than African slaves, like the most important good that was traded, is sugar. Sugar was insanely profitable, bringing in 4 million pounds per year, and that's like English pounds, the actual value, the dollar, not the weight, which was almost 50% more valuable than every other crop combined. Sugar would make the West Indies wildly valuable, and they will be lands that are fought over consistently in the 17th and the 18th century, even all the way up to the turn of the 20th century when we get involved in a war with Spain in 1898, fighting over islands in the Caribbean. So what exactly were these navigation acts, and what limits did they put on trade? Well, we'll answer that question in just a minute. Hey class, I just wanted to let you know that if you would like to raise your hand and participate, please feel free to reach out. You can find us on Twitter with the handle @TheTeachersHist, on Facebook @TheTeachersHistory Podcast. I know that we had to skip a week last week, and I apologize for that, but there were some personal issues that had to be dealt with, and if that ever happens again, and I need to make an announcement updating the programming, I will do it through Twitter or Facebook. So if you follow me on those platforms, you'll be able to find out. Please, if you could, leave a rating and a review on iTunes and subscribe to the show. It's a huge help. All right, now let's get back to the lesson. Now, I've mentioned the Navigation Acts a few times, so what exactly were they? Well, the first Navigation Act was passed in 1651, and this was England's way to make sure they had a, quote, favorable balance of trade. They believed that in order to bring in the profit that they so desired, they had to control the trade of the colonies at least a little bit. So they told the colonies that they wanted their trade goods to be carried to English ports by English ships. The entire purpose of the Navigation Act was to make sure the colonists' trade was controlled by England, which would then prevent French and Dutch settlers and traders from pilfering their potential profit. In 1660 and 1663, England strengthened these acts by telling the colonists they could only export sugar and tobacco to England and only import goods through England. Securing this trade was seen as critically important to the English crown because through conflicts in the 1650s to the 1670s, England had totally pushed the Dutch out of the colonies and dominated Atlantic shipping. The crown believed they needed to make sure they had a stranglehold on as much colonial profit as they could. And while these acts certainly limited the freedom of trade for many colonists, they also guaranteed trade with English markets and cut out some of the competition. By the end of the 1700s, Boston was one of the biggest ports in the world. But as you can probably imagine, just because the crown tells the colonies they can't do it doesn't mean they're actually going to, not do it. The colonies were still trading with the Dutch and, of course, getting some of that sweet, sweet sugar and molasses from the French in the West Indies. But these navigation acts did cause considerable frustration for some, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony said as much when they declared that, quote, the laws of England are bounded within the seas and do not reach America. This declaration didn't go over well in England, and after being offended by this assertion that, Englishmen maintain the rights of England, England made New Hampshire a royal colony, which was initially part of Massachusetts, but part of Massachusetts no more. In addition to this, in 1684, the Massachusetts Bay Charter, that was revoked, and the Church of England was virtually outlawed in Massachusetts. So in the end, the question we have to consider is, did the Navigation Acts actually hurt or help the colonies? Well, while there were certainly restrictions on trade, they were too cumbersome to effectively enforce. England was busy fighting with the Dutch and the French and didn't have the time or the manpower to focus their energies on these acts. This period in American history during the 17th century, and all the way up to the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, is known as the period of salutary neglect. Many English leaders did not believe in strictly enforcing the Navigation Acts, and Prime Minister Robert Walpole even stated that, quote, if no restrictions were placed on the colonies, they would flourish. During this time, the value of imports from England to the colony far exceeded the value of exports. the colonies, through this relationship, gathered a wealth of finished products that they otherwise wouldn't have. Additionally, being in debt to England also meant that English capital was being invested back into the colonies because they had to make sure the colonies were able to pay off the debt. Therefore, the English crown had a vested interest in making the colonies profitable. There were some enumerated goods, and these enumerated goods were goods that the colonies had to trade directly to England. And so England did list very specific things that had to go directly to England, such as tobacco, cotton, ginger, indigo, and sugar. And while at first blush, this sounds like a problem, for some planters, this was great. They had exclusive trading rights to many items, and foreign goods were heavily taxed, so they didn't offer a lot of competition. Additionally, many non-enumerated items, such as grain, flour, and meat, were making the middle colonies particularly wealthy, as they traded these things with the South and with the West Indies. In New England, shipbuilding was taking off, and by the mid-18th century, nearly a third of all British ships were made in America. The port cities in the north profited greatly off of illegal shipping to the West Indies, as they would bring in sugar and ship out rum. And of course, these illegal traders had salutary neglect to thank for this. This salutary neglect actually makes smuggling almost a popular and respected profession, and the bribery of English officials was more common in some areas than non-bribery. Oh, and the English officials? Not so competent. Often they were appointed through political favors, and their lack of effectiveness, of course, led to increasing colonial independence. One crop that was particularly hurt by these navigation acts, though, was tobacco. And that's because the middle colonies produced far more tobacco than England could actually smoke. So by the mid-1700s, many of these tobacco planters turned towards wheat. The middle colonies, the breadbasket of early America. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to take a moment to just reflect on the broader impact that these policies had on the English colonies. There was a clear economic relationship being born between the northern colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. Because of this intercolonial trade, slavery was directly or indirectly contributing to the growth of the northern colonies and undeniably linking the commercialism in the northern colonies with the production and profits of the southern colonies. For the most part, the northern colonies did not have a specific raw material that they were profiting off of. Instead, it was primarily trade with the South and the West Indies and all the shipping fees and insurance that brought in their profits. During this period of salutary neglect, the colonies continued to grow and become increasingly wealthy, and they began to experience freedom in some areas of trade and local government. They brought in more than they sold and made up for this inequality in colonial shipping fees. The growth of the English colonies during this period led to an increasing reliance, though, on their mother country, Great Britain, and an entrenchment of an economic relationship that is going to be hard to break away from during the early days of the Revolutionary period. As we move forward in this podcast, keep in mind this very complicated and at times mutually beneficial relationship between the colonies and the crown. Following the French Indian War in 1763, England finds itself in considerable debt, and these ideas of salutary neglect go out the window, and the crown begins to more strictly enforce the Navigation Acts. You know, the laws that have been in place for like 100 years. Well, by doing this, they take the colonists by surprise and make some feel like they have no recourse other than to rebel. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. Next week, we will be covering the Glorious Revolution of 1689 its effects on the colonies, and the various conflicts between the English and the French that will lead us up to the French and Indian War. Additionally, our next episode is actually going to be released on Saturday because I will be out of town next Tuesday. So that episode will drop a couple days early on Saturday, and then we'll pick up with our normal Tuesday schedule. See you then.